Imagine a mother standing over a crib at 4 in the morning. Her hands are rough from 12 hours at the loom. Her back aches in ways she has no words for, and in those hands she holds a small brown bottle, no bigger than her thumb, no heavier than a prayer, and she tips it gently toward the mouth of her infant child. Not because she wants to, not because she doesn't love that baby with every broken fiber of her being, but because the factory whistle will blow in 2 hours, and the baby cannot come with her, and there is no one else, and the crying must stop. And this small brown bottle is the only answer the world has given her. Close your eyes. Can you see her? Can you feel the weight of that bottle in your own hands? Her name might have been Mary, or Anna, or Catherine. She might have lived in Manchester or in the textile towns of Massachusetts, in the coal valleys of Pennsylvania or the mill rows of Birmingham. She was not a monster. She was not cruel. She was desperate in a way that most of us, with our soft beds and our refrigerators full of food, will never truly understand. She was a woman doing the only thing she could think to do in a world that had given her no good choices at all. That bottle in her hand was called Godfrey's cordial, or Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, or Dolby's carinative. The names were gentle, domestic, almost cheerful, as if the substance inside were nothing more dangerous than chamomile tea. But inside that bottle, dissolved in alcohol and sugar, was a tincture of opium, liquid, potent, and given freely to infants, given daily to children who were too small to protest and too innocent to understand what was happening to their tiny, fragile bodies. This is not a comfortable story. I want you to know that from the very beginning, this is a story about poverty, so profound it rewired the instincts of motherhood itself. It is a story about systems that devoured children, literally fed them to machines and to drugs, while calling itself progress. And it is a story that deserves to be told, not with horror and judgment, but with the kind of grief that only comes when we truly try to understand what it meant to be poor, to be a woman, to be a mother, in the 19th century. Stay with me, because what you are about to hear is not simply history, it is a mirror. And in that mirror, if we look long and honestly enough, we will see not only them, but ourselves. If no one ever told you that this happened, then hit that like button, because these women deserve to be remembered. And every like is a hand reaching back through time to say, we see you. We didn't forget. To understand why those bottles existed, you have to first understand the world that made them necessary. And that world, that relentless, grinding, smoke-blackened world, was unlike anything we can easily picture from the comfort of the 21st century. The Industrial Revolution did not arrive gently. It came like a flood, sudden, overwhelming, and indifferent to the lives it swept away. In the span of a few decades, economies rooted in land were uprooted and replanted in factories, mills, mines, furnaces that burned through the night. And into those furnaces the poor fed everything they had, their time, their bodies, and eventually, their children. In the textile towns, the working day stretched from before sunrise to well after dark, 12 hours, 14 hours, sometimes 18. There was no minimum wage. There was no sick leave. There was no maternity leave. A phrase incomprehensible to a mill owner of 1840. A woman who gave birth on Monday was expected to be back at her loom by the end of the week. Not because employers were sadistic, but because the economics of industrial poverty left no room for tenderness. Miss too many days, and someone else would have your place, and without that place, your family did not eat. This is the architecture of the crisis, a system so vast and indifferent that it ground individual lives to powder. The mother who went back to the factory for days after giving birth was obeying a crueler law, the law of survival, and the baby she left behind, with a neighbor or a hired minder who watched 6 children at once, needed to be manageable, needed to be quiet, needed, in the vocabulary of the time, to be soothed. And so the bottles appeared, sold cheaply in corner shops of working-class neighborhoods, advertised alongside remedies for coughs. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, perhaps, the most infamous, promised to relieve suffering during teething and promote sleep. Its advertisements featured serene mothers and peacefully sleeping infants. What they did not feature was the 65 milligrams of morphine sulfate per fluid ounce that made all that serenity possible. 65 milligrams per fluid ounce, given to infants, given daily, given by mothers who had no idea, because no one was required to tell them what they were pouring into their children. If you know someone who needs to hear this story, share this video with them, because this history was kept quiet for too long, and silence, as we are about to learn, was always the most dangerous thing in that era. What did opium do to a 19th century infant? The answer, clinical and cold as it sounds, when stated plainly, is the same thing it does to any human body. It simply does it faster and more completely, to one so small and so undefended. The opiates in these syrups bound to the developing receptors of the child's brain and nervous system like a key turning in a lock. They slowed the breath, they softened the cry. They made the world go quiet in a way that looked exactly like sleep. To an exhausted mother rushing out the door at 5 in the morning, it looked peaceful. Still, the kind of stillness a tired woman mistakes for rest, because she needs it to be rest, because the alternative is something she cannot afford. But it was not rest, it was suppression. Neurological, respiratory, chemical suppression of everything that makes a living creature alert to the world. The children who received these syrups regularly, day after day, week after week, because the mother was always at the factory. The minder needed them quiet. There was always another bottle at the corner shop. These children paid prices their mothers could not see. Some became addicted before they could walk. Their bodies, barely months old, had already learned to expect the syrup, to crave the particular quietness. They would grow restless and wailing and inconsolable in its absence. An infant already in the grip of a physical dependency it had no part choosing, already needing a drug the way it needed milk. Some simply did not wake up. The medical literature of the period is scattered with references to infants, found cold in their cradles, described as having overlain. This was the polite fiction that a sleeping mother had rolled onto her child. But modern historians see a different pattern. Clusters of infant deaths in factory towns, concentrated in the weeks when work was heaviest and the bottles were used most freely. Not murder, not neglect, in any simple sense. Something more complex and devastating. A death produced by the intersection of poverty and pharmaceutical ignorance. A society that had decided, at the deepest structural level, that the children of the poor were an acceptable loss. Close your eyes. Can you hear it? The silence that fell over those cradles. Not the silence of sleep. The other silence, the one that doesn't end. And the mothers who came home to find that silence, what did they feel? What words did they have for the thing that had happened? History does not record their private grief with much care. The records of the poor are always sparse. But we know they went back to work. We know they sometimes had another child. They kept buying the bottles, because what else was there? Because the factory whistle did not pause for grief. Survival did not pause for grief. And the world they lived in had never, not once, been designed with their grief in mind. The bottles did not make themselves, and the women who bought them were not buying them in a vacuum. They were buying them from an industry that knew what it was selling. The patent medicine trade of the 19th century was one of the most profitable and least regulated industries in the English-speaking world. The term patent medicine is itself a kind of historical irony. Most of these products were not patented at all in the modern sense. They were simply proprietary, meaning their ingredients were secret, their labels were vague, and manufacturers had no legal obligation to disclose contents. The men who built these fortunes were not, by the standards of their time, considered criminals. They were entrepreneurs, innovators. They ran advertisements in newspapers. They hired traveling salesmen who moved through towns like preachers. They sponsored almanacs full of testimonials. Grateful mothers swore that Godfrey's cordial had saved their sanity and their children's comfort. They were skilled at the language of reassurance. They spoke the dialect of care, the imagery of warm kitchens, of rested mothers, of sleeping babies, and behind that language they concealed addiction. William Godfrey, whose cordial would become a standard household item in English working-class homes, was a London apothecary. The Winslow behind Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup was likely invented, a marketing choice designed to evoke the authority of an experienced mother. The women these products claimed to help were, in fact, being used as the face of a trade that was quietly killing their children. It would be easy to paint these manufacturers as simply evil, but the truth is more complicated and, in some ways, more damning. Many of them genuinely believed their products were beneficial. Opium had been used medicinally for centuries. The slow, cumulative harm of regular small doses to developing infant bodies was not yet documented in any systematic way. Science was decades behind the reality that was unfolding in those cradles. And in the absence of science, commerce spoke. The physicians and public health authorities were themselves products of a world that was only beginning to develop tools to measure harm. The connection between a product and infant mortality rates in factory districts required a kind of data-driven inquiry that was still in its infancy. And in the meantime, the bottles sold, and the babies slept, and the silence spread through the mill towns like fog. If this episode is opening your eyes to a chapter of history that should be known by everyone, leave a comment below. Just one word, if that's all you have, because every comment tells the algorithm that this story matters, and this story matters. The world did not change overnight. It rarely does. But there came a point in the latter half of the 19th century when the accumulation of evidence became too heavy to ignore. The reformers came first. Women from the comfortable classes who had the education to notice patterns that the poor could not afford to name. Journalists went into factory towns, and physicians noticed with unease that the infant death rate was pointedly high where the patent medicine trade was busiest. In 1868, the British Pharmacy Act required that opium-containing preparations be labelled as poison. It was a small beginning. The syrups did not disappear overnight. A bottle marked poison was still for sale, and a mother with no other option would still buy it. In America, the shift came slower. The patent medicine industry was enormous, politically connected, and deeply woven into the economy of newspaper advertising. But muckraking journalists began exposing the truth. Samuel Hopkins Adams wrote The Great American Fraud in 1905, naming the products and the men profiting. It caused a necessary scandal. The Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906 was the legislative response. The government required products containing opium or morphine to be labeled, forcing the industry out of the shadows and into the light of disclosure. The mothers buying those bottles had been making uninformed choices in a world that kept them uninformed deliberately. That information had been hidden by commerce and protected by law. When the ingredients were finally disclosed, many mothers stopped buying. They had not been bad mothers. They had been mothers in a bad world. And if you have stayed with me through all of this, subscribe to this channel. Not for the algorithm. For them. Subscribe, so that the next time we bring one of them back, you'll be here to receive her. We are very far, most of us, from those factory towns. We do not stand over cribs at 4 in the morning with brown bottles. We have pediatricians and pharmacies with trained staff and labels that list every ingredient in clear print. We have the accumulated knowledge of 150 years of public health science, imperfect as it still is, standing between us. And yet, there is something in this story that refuses to stay in the past. Because the mechanism that drove those mothers to those bottles, the mechanism of a society that places the burden of impossible choices on the shoulders of the poorest, that withholds information from those least equipped to demand it, that allows commerce to speak in the spaces where regulation stays silent. That mechanism did not die with the patent medicine trade. It adapted. It found new forms. It is, if we are willing to look, still operating in the world today, and the names on the bottles have simply changed. The mothers of the 19th century were not failures of morality. They were the output of a system that needed their labor and was willing to consume their children to get it. And when we look at them, when we really look, with honesty, we should not see monsters. We should see something that requires more courage to acknowledge ourselves in different circumstances, under different pressure, trying to keep something alive in a world that keeps asking us to sacrifice what we love most. Close your eyes one more time, not to see a factory town or a brown bottle or a crib gone quiet. Close your eyes and try to feel the weight of what those women carried. Not just the weight of work and poverty and exhaustion, but the weight of love that had no good choices, the weight of wanting for your child to be safe and fed and rested, and having to choose, over and over again, between versions of that were all, in different ways, breaking your heart. That weight is not historical. It does not belong to the past. It belongs to anyone who has ever made an impossible choice. If this story stayed with you, if it moved something in you, I want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments. This community has always been a place where history is felt, and these women deserve to be felt. Thank you for being here. This was heartbreaking true stories from history. We keep the flame of the past alive, because it made us, and we owe it attention. Every memory is a lesson, and every lesson a legacy. Until the next episode.